The mail-order marksman. The Springfield rifle arrived at Camp O'Donnell in a Red Cross package marked "Sporting Goods," and Corporal Jimmy Matsuda almost threw it in the supply shed with the rest of the contraband. It was December 1942, 18 months into the Pacific War, and the Japanese guards had grown suspicious of anything that looked remotely military. But this wasn't a military issue. It was a civilian hunting rifle, ordered from a Sears catalogue before the war by some farmer's son who'd never made it home to claim it. The barrel was shorter than regulation, the stock was plain walnut instead of military hardwood, and the scope was a cheap 4-power glass that had probably never been zeroed properly. Even in the dim light of the makeshift armory beneath the camp's medical barracks, it looked like exactly what Sergeant Bill Hayes called it when he examined the weapon 3 days later. "Mail-order piece of junk," Hayes laughed, turning the rifle over in his hands. Hayes was regular Army, a career soldier who'd fought at Bataan before the surrender, and he had opinions about proper military equipment. You couldn't hit a barn with that department store special. Real soldiers use real weapons. The rifle's owner said nothing. Private Tommy Chen had been quiet since arriving at O'Donnell 3 months earlier, transferred from the work camps up north after what the Japanese called an incident with camp discipline. Chen was Chinese-American, born in San Francisco's Chinatown, and the other prisoners weren't quite sure what to make of him. He was small, maybe 5'6", with calloused hands that suggested farm work, and he had the unsettling habit of watching the Japanese guards with the same intensity other men reserved for studying escape routes. What none of them knew was that Chen had spent his childhood summers on his grandfather's ranch in the Central Valley, learning to hunt jackrabbits with an ancient lever-action rifle that kicked like a mule and hadn't been accurate past 50 yards. His grandfather had taught him that precision wasn't about the weapon, it was about patience, breathing, and understanding your target's habits. "Good rifle, bad rifle, doesn't matter," the old man had said in his broken English during those long afternoons when the heat shimmered off the valley floor and young Tommy learned to read wind patterns in the grass. "What matters is, you know your business." The business Chen knew best, as it turned out, was killing. Camp O'Donnell sat in a valley 40 miles northwest of Manila, surrounded by dense jungle that had become a highway for Filipino guerrilla fighters. The monsoon season had ended weeks ago, leaving the air thick and still, heavy with the scent of rotting vegetation and the constant buzz of insects. The camp itself was a grid of bamboo barracks surrounded by barbed wire, housing nearly 3,000 American and Filipino prisoners who'd surrendered after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. Colonel Hashimoto, the Japanese commander, had grown increasingly paranoid about nighttime attacks as 1942 wore into 1943. From his office window, he could see the tree line where guerrilla bands slipped through the jungle darkness, hitting guard posts with lightning raids and vanishing before dawn. In 6 months, they'd killed 17 Japanese soldiers and freed more than 30 prisoners, always striking during the darkest hours when visibility was nearly zero. Hashimoto's solution was brutal and methodical. Every time guerrillas struck a guard post, he would randomly select 10 prisoners for execution. Every escape attempt would cost 20 lives. Every act of sabotage meant reduced food rations for the entire camp. It was collective punishment designed to turn the prisoners against anyone who might be supporting the resistance. Chen watched all of this from his bunk near the medical barracks, observing the patterns of patrol schedules and guard rotations with the same patient attention he'd once given to tracking wounded deer through Central Valley oak groves. He noticed how the Japanese sentries grew tired during the long night watches, how they tended to bunch together near the guard towers when the jungle sounds grew too loud, how their officers preferred to position command posts upslope from fighting positions to maintain visual control. By February 1943, the camp's secret leadership council was facing an impossible choice. The guerrilla attacks were keeping Japanese forces tied down and providing hope to the prisoners, but the reprisals were becoming unbearable. Men were dying of starvation and execution at a rate that would empty the camp within a year. Something had to change, but conventional military thinking offered no solutions. They couldn't fight back directly. They had perhaps 20 functional weapons hidden throughout the camp, facing a garrison of 200 Japanese soldiers with machine guns, mortars, and radio contact with reinforcements in Manila. That's when Chen made his proposal during a midnight meeting in the camp hospital, speaking for the first time since his arrival about more than requests for medical supplies or work detail assignments. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. The meeting took place in the surgery room, where Dr. Martinez, a captured Navy medic from San Diego, performed what operations he could with instruments smuggled from Red Cross shipments. Chen had volunteered to help move supplies, but the other prisoners suspected he'd been listening to their conversations longer than anyone realized. "I want the rifle," Chen said quietly, when Hayes finished explaining why direct resistance would be suicide. "And I want to hunt the hunters." Hayes stared at him in the yellow light of a stolen Japanese lantern. "Son, that thing couldn't drop a deer at 100 yards. What makes you think—" "Not the garrison," Chen interrupted. "The patrols. The small units they send into the jungle to set ambushes for the guerrillas. I've been watching them for 8 months." Major Connolly, the senior American officer present, leaned forward. He was thin as everyone else, but his voice still carried the authority of a man who'd commanded a battalion on Bataan. "You're talking about leaving the camp. Getting caught means execution for you and 10 others. Maybe more." "They won't catch me," Chen said, "and they won't connect it to the camp. Every shot I take will be during existing firefights, just another guerrilla with better aim." Dr. Martinez set down the surgical clamp he'd been cleaning. "Tommy, you've never said more than 5 words at a time since you got here. Now you want to become Carlos Hathcock?" "My grandfather taught me to hunt in California," Chen said. "Jackrabbits mostly. But the principles are the same. Patience, understanding your target, knowing their habits." He paused, looking at each man in turn. Outside, they could hear the Japanese guards calling to each other as they changed shifts, their voices carrying across the compound in the still night air. "Good rifle, bad rifle, doesn't matter," Chen continued, echoing his grandfather's words. "What matters is you know your business." Hayes shook his head. "Even if you could take out a patrol or 2, they'd hunt you down and execute half the camp in retaliation. Not if they think the guerrillas did it." Chen had clearly thought this through. Strike during existing engagements when gunshots are lost in the noise. Leave no trace connecting back to the camp. Make every elimination look like improved guerrilla tactics. For 2 weeks, the Leadership Council debated Chen's proposal in hushed conversations during work details and meal distributions. The plan was audacious in its simplicity, but the risks were enormous. If Chen were captured or killed, if even one Japanese soldier survived to report being attacked by an unknown sniper, the reprisals could devastate the camp. Meanwhile, Chen began preparing. He studied Japanese patrol patterns with renewed intensity, noting how they preferred certain approach routes to guerrilla territory, how they positioned their heavy weapons teams, how their radio operators stayed close to unit commanders. He memorized the timing of guerrilla attacks, learning to predict when and where the next engagement might occur. On February 15th, intelligence reports filtered into the camp through Filipino workers who brought in construction supplies. An 8-man Japanese patrol was planning to ambush a known guerrilla route near the Candaba River, 2 miles southeast of the camp. The attack was scheduled for February 18th, during the new moon when visibility would be minimal. "This is it," Major Connolly told Chen during a brief meeting near the latrines. "If you're going to do this thing, now's your chance." Chen nodded. I'll need 40 rounds of ammunition and a Red Cross medical bag. Something the guards will ignore if they see it. And if you don't come back, then you'll know the plan doesn't work, Chen said simply. But if I do come back, and there are no reprisals, then we'll know we have a way to help the guerrillas without getting our people killed. That night, Chen lay on his bamboo mat, listening to the jungle sounds beyond the camp perimeter. Insects buzzed in clouds around the guard towers, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called with a sound like a child crying. He thought about his grandfather's ranch, about the patient hours spent learning to read wind and calculate range, about the weight of responsibility that came with taking a life. Tomorrow night he would slip out of Camp O'Donnell carrying a rifle that professional soldiers dismissed as inadequate, planning to hunt men who'd been trained by some of the most effective jungle warfare specialists in the world. The mathematics of survival had never been starker. What would you remember more, the hunger or the weight of impossible choices? The first test came on February 18th, exactly as intelligence had predicted. Chen slipped out during the pre-dawn darkness, carrying his rifle and 40 rounds of ammunition in a Red Cross medical bag that would be ignored by casual patrols. The camp's perimeter guards had learned to look the other way when prisoners moved between barracks for medical emergencies, and Dr. Martinez had provided the perfect cover story, a dysentery outbreak requiring immediate attention. Chen moved through the jungle with the patience his grandfather had taught him, reading the terrain like a familiar book. The Kandaba River ran through a narrow valley bordered by dense vegetation, with several natural choke points where guerrillas typically funneled Japanese patrols into killing zones. He positioned himself 300 yards upslope from the most likely ambush site, where he could observe the Japanese positions without being detected. At 11:30 p.m., the guerrillas walked into the trap, exactly as the Japanese had planned. Automatic weapons fire erupted from 3 positions as the patrol attempted to pin down the Filipino fighters in a deadly crossfire. But Chen was already in position. His mail-order scope focused on muzzle flashes that appeared and disappeared in the jungle darkness. His first shot took out the patrol's radio operator, a crucial target that would prevent calls for reinforcement. The crack of his rifle was lost in the general cacophony of the firefight. His second shot silenced a light machine gun that had been raking the guerrilla position. By the time the Japanese realized they were taking fire from an unexpected direction, Chen had eliminated 4 of their 8 men, and the surviving guerrillas were launching a fierce counterattack from positions they should never have been able to reach. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, 8 Japanese soldiers were dead, and the guerrilla band had escaped with minimal casualties, carrying weapons and ammunition that would make their next raid even more effective. More importantly, no Japanese survivors could report that their ambush had been compromised by an unknown sniper with exceptional night shooting skills. Chen returned to camp before dawn, cleaned his rifle with the methodical care his grandfather had taught him, and reported to work detail as if nothing had happened. He showed no signs of the adrenaline crash that comes after combat, no trembling hands or thousand-yard stare. If anything, he seemed calmer than usual, as if some inner tension had finally been resolved. 3 days later, Colonel Hashimoto announced that guerrilla activity in the sector had become temporarily more sophisticated, but attributed the patrol's destruction to improved Filipino tactics and better coordination with American submarine forces. No reprisals were taken against the camp population. The second engagement came 12 days later, when Japanese intelligence identified a guerrilla supply cache near the Pampanga River. This time the patrol was larger, 12 men with heavy weapons, and they'd chosen their ambush site with greater care. But Chen had been studying Japanese tactical doctrine for 8 months, and he'd noticed something their officers apparently hadn't. They consistently positioned their command post upslope from their fighting positions, giving officers a better view of the engagement while keeping them safely away from initial contact. Chen's strategy was correspondingly more complex. He would target the command element first, then work systematically through the patrol support weapons before the guerrillas even arrived. By the time the Filipino fighters triggered the ambush, the Japanese would be fighting without coordination or heavy firepower. The battle began at 2:17 a.m. when the patrol's pointman spotted movement along the river trail. But before the Japanese could spring their trap, Chen's first shot eliminated their lieutenant, and his second shot destroyed their radio. His third and fourth shots took out both machine gun crews, and his fifth shot killed the sergeant who was trying to rally the survivors. When the guerrillas engaged minutes later, they found an enemy that had already been systematically dismantled. What should have been a desperate fighting withdrawal became a series of small unit actions that the Filipino fighters dominated completely. 12 more Japanese soldiers died that night, along with their dreams of controlling the guerrilla supply lines. Word of the mysterious sniper began spreading through both guerrilla networks and Japanese intelligence channels, but the reports were contradictory and confusing. Filipino fighters reported that their ambushes were succeeding beyond all expectations, with Japanese patrols seemingly unable to coordinate effective responses. Japanese commanders reported that guerrilla marksmanship had improved dramatically, possibly indicating training by American advisors or weapons supplied by submarine. What none of them suspected was that the deadliest marksman in the Philippines was sleeping on a bamboo mat in Camp O'Donnell, maintaining perfect discipline during daily roll calls, and spending his evenings cleaning a rifle that most professional soldiers considered barely adequate for hunting deer. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. By early March, the changes in camp routine were subtle but unmistakable. Guard patrols that had once ventured confidently into the jungle now stayed closer to the perimeter. Japanese officers spoke in hushed tones about phantom guerrillas and submarine-delivered specialists. Most importantly, the random executions that had terrorized the prisoners for months had stopped entirely as Colonel Hashimoto grew reluctant to reduce his garrison strength. Chen continued his nighttime hunts with mechanical precision. His third mission targeted a major sweep designed to trap a 40-man guerrilla band near Bamban Creek. Instead of eliminating a single patrol, he attempted to disrupt the entire operation by systematically destroying its key elements: radio communications, automatic weapons crews, and unit commanders. The timeline compressed into a single night of continuous movement and engagement, requiring Chen to cover more than 4 miles of jungle terrain while engaging multiple enemy positions. By 3 a.m., what had been a coordinated sweep by 60 Japanese soldiers had collapsed into 3 separate groups of demoralized men, wandering through jungle darkness without communication, heavy weapons, or clear objectives. 24 more Japanese soldiers died that night, including 2 lieutenants and a captain who had been hand-picked for their jungle warfare expertise. Dr. Martinez began to notice changes in Chen beyond his increasingly frequent absences from the barracks. During medical examinations, the doctor observed that Chen's resting heart rate had dropped significantly, and his hands remained steady even under stress. More concerning was the way Chen had begun to isolate himself from other prisoners, eating alone and speaking only when directly addressed. "Tommy," the doctor said one afternoon, as Chen helped organize medical supplies, "you want to talk about what's happening out there?" Chen continued sorting bandages without looking up. "Nothing to talk about. I do my job, come back, sleep, same as anyone else on work detail." "Work detail doesn't usually involve ammunition counting and range estimation," Martinez observed quietly. For the first time in weeks, Chen stopped what he was doing and met the doctor's eyes. "You want to know what I think about? Every night before I go out?" Martinez nodded. "My grandfather's ranch in the Central Valley. Summer afternoons when the heat made everything shimmer like water. He used to say that hunting wasn't about the kill, it was about understanding. Understanding the animal, understanding the land, understanding yourself. Chen resumed sorting bandages, his movements precise and economical. These Japanese soldiers, they're not animals. They're men with families and fears and dreams, just like us. But they're also the reason 10 prisoners die every time the guerrillas strike a guard post. They're the reason children in this camp are dying of starvation. And that makes it easier? No, Chen said quietly. It makes it necessary. There's a difference. Meanwhile, the Japanese High Command's response to the mysterious sniper was swift and telling. Instead of increasing security around Camp O'Donnell, they began investigating possible American submarine activity along the coast, convinced that Special Forces advisors had infiltrated the guerrilla networks. Intelligence reports spoke of unprecedented sniper activity and coordinated interdiction of patrol operations. But the analysis focused entirely on external threats. Sergeant Hayes, who had initially dismissed Chen's rifle as inadequate, began to see the results of precision over power. During their next clandestine meeting, he studied after-action reports smuggled into camp by Filipino workers. 14 engineers and support personnel eliminated at the Tarlac River construction site, Hayes read from a crumpled document. No survivors, no witnesses, no evidence of coordinated attack. Japanese intelligence believes guerrilla capabilities have been significantly enhanced by outside assistance. Major Connolly nodded grimly. They're pulling back their patrol operations and concentrating on defensive positions. Chen's forcing them to give the guerrillas free run of half the countryside. At what cost? Dr. Martinez asked. Have you looked at him lately? Really looked? The question hung in the air like smoke from the cooking fires outside. Chen had become a ghost in their midst, present but somehow absent, carrying out his deadly missions with the same methodical calm he brought to camp maintenance duties. He was saving lives, the mathematics were undeniable, but something essential was being consumed in the process. Outside, the afternoon rain began to fall on Camp O'Donnell's tin roofs, a steady drumming that would continue until dawn. In 6 hours, Chen would slip out into the darkness again, carrying his mail-order rifle toward another carefully planned engagement. The war would continue, the guerrillas would grow bolder, and somewhere in Manila, Japanese officers would update their maps with new red zones where their patrols no longer dared to venture. But in the medical barracks, 3 men who had known war from different angles sat in silence, wondering what victory might ultimately cost the man who was making it possible. How long can a man carry the weight of necessary choices without losing something that can never be recovered? The revelation came on March 24th, when Japanese intelligence finally identified the location of the primary guerrilla base camp in the mountains east of Camp O'Donnell. The operation to destroy it involved 90 soldiers, including elite mountain warfare specialists, and represented the largest anti-guerrilla sweep attempted in the sector. Chen learned about the planned operation through the same Filipino workers who brought construction supplies into camp, but this time the intelligence carried a personal dimension that changed everything. Among the equipment manifests stolen from Japanese headquarters was a detailed inventory of weapons captured from the guerrilla base. American rifles, ammunition, medical supplies, and radio equipment that could only have come from one source. The guerrillas were using weapons smuggled out of Camp O'Donnell. Dr. Martinez showed Chen the documents during their next private meeting, watching the younger man's face for any sign of reaction. The numbers were undeniable. Over the past 8 months, nearly 40 weapons had been secretly transferred from the camp's hidden armory to Filipino resistance fighters operating in the mountains. "Did you know?" Martinez asked quietly. Chen studied the papers in the dim light of the medical barracks. "I suspected. Too many coincidences. Too much coordination between guerrilla attacks and our intelligence reports." "And that doesn't bother you?" "Doctor," Chen said, setting down the documents. 3 months ago, Colonel Hashimoto was executing 10 prisoners every time the guerrillas struck a guard post. Now he can't spare the men because he's lost nearly 100 soldiers to a sniper he thinks is training the resistance. We're not just surviving anymore. We're fighting back. But there was more to the revelation than tactical coordination. Hidden in the manifests was evidence of something Chen hadn't expected. Among the captured guerrilla equipment were personal items that belonged to prisoners who had supposedly died of disease or malnutrition. Wedding rings, family photographs, letters from home, items that would never have left the camp unless their owners had left with them. The escape network was real, and it was larger than anyone had imagined. How many? Chen asked. Best estimate? Maybe 60 men over the past year. The Japanese report them as deaths from various causes, but the paperwork doesn't always add up. Chen thought about the men who had simply disappeared from camp rolls, prisoners whose absence had been explained as transfers to work camps or casualties from the dysentery outbreaks that periodically swept through the compound. He'd assumed, like everyone else, that death was the only way out of Camp O'Donnell. The operation against the guerrilla base, Chen said finally. When? Tomorrow night. 3 columns of 30 men each, converging from different directions. Chen's strategy was correspondingly ambitious. Instead of simply disrupting the operation, he would attempt to turn it into a catastrophic defeat that would force the Japanese to abandon large-scale patrol operations entirely. His method was based on a principle his grandfather had taught him about hunting pack animals. Eliminate the leaders first, and the pack will scatter. But as he prepared for what would be his most dangerous mission yet, Chen found himself thinking not about tactical considerations or range calculations, but about the personal items in those intelligence reports. Wedding rings and family photographs that had traveled from Camp O'Donnell to mountain hideouts, carried by men who had chosen to fight rather than simply endure. For the first time since beginning his nighttime hunts, Chen wondered if he was fighting the right war. The operation began at 10 p.m. with 3 columns, advancing along separate routes toward the guerrilla stronghold. Chen positioned himself along the primary approach route, where the main command element and heaviest weapons were concentrated. His plan was to eliminate key leaders and specialists during the initial advance, then shadow the column as it retreated, continuing to inflict casualties until the entire operation collapsed. His first shot, fired at 11:42 p.m., killed the operation's commanding major, a veteran of jungle warfare in Malaya who had been personally selected for this mission. His second shot eliminated the senior radio operator, cutting communication with the other columns. His third through 7th shots systematically destroyed the column's heavy weapons crews, leaving them unable to respond effectively to guerrilla contact. But Chen's tactical masterpiece came when he began targeting specific individuals whose loss would create maximum confusion. The senior medic, the navigation specialist, the demolitions expert, and the scout, who was most familiar with local terrain. By 1 a.m., the 30-man column was leaderless, lost, and fighting for survival against guerrillas who seemed to anticipate their every move. The other 2 columns fared no better. When they lost radio contact with the command element, they continued their advance into what had become a perfectly orchestrated ambush. The guerrillas, fighting with unprecedented confidence and coordination, inflicted casualties that forced both columns into immediate withdrawal. By dawn, 37 Japanese soldiers were dead, including some of their most experienced jungle warfare specialists. The guerrilla base camp remained secure, and Japanese patrol activity in the sector would be reduced to small, defensive operations that posed no serious threat to either the guerrillas or Camp O'Donnell. But as Chen cleaned his rifle in the pre-dawn darkness, he found himself thinking about those personal items in the intelligence reports, about the men who had chosen escape over endurance, about the thin line between survival and resistance. Tomorrow, he would return to Camp O'Donnell and resume the routine of a prisoner. But something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what that meant. The war was larger than he had imagined, and his role in it was more complex than simply hunting the hunters. If you discovered that everything you thought you knew about your situation was only part of a much larger truth, would you change what you were doing? Chen's final mission came in early April, when desperation drove Japanese commanders to authorize a night raid against Camp O'Donnell itself. Intelligence reports convinced them that the prisoners were somehow supporting guerrilla operations, though they couldn't prove direct connection. The raid was planned as a reconnaissance in force, designed to capture and interrogate key prisoners who might provide intelligence about guerrilla networks. This was the engagement Chen had been preparing for since February, the ultimate test of whether his mail-order rifle could protect not just guerrilla fighters, but his fellow prisoners. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the raid succeeded, dozens of prisoners would be tortured and executed, and the camp's secret resistance network would be completely compromised. Chen's position was a carefully prepared hide site 400 yards from the camp's main gate, where he could observe the entire approach route and engage targets at optimal range. His plan was to eliminate the raid's key personnel during their final approach, creating enough confusion to allow camp sentries to raise an alarm and organize defensive positions. The raiding party consisted of 24 elite soldiers moving in absolute silence toward what they believed would be an undefended target. They had no way of knowing that one of their intended victims was tracking their movement through a 4-power scope, calculating range and wind drift for shots that would determine whether hundreds of prisoners lived or died. Chen's first shot, fired at 2:33 a.m., killed the raid leader just as he was preparing to signal the final assault. His second shot eliminated the demolitions expert who was carrying charges meant to breach the camp's main gate. His third, through eighth shots, systematically destroyed the raiding party's automatic weapons crews, leaving the survivors with nothing but individual small arms and rapidly evaporating confidence. What followed was not a raid, but a rout. The surviving Japanese soldiers, convinced they had walked into a carefully prepared ambush, withdrew in complete disorder, leaving behind weapons and equipment that would later be retrieved by camp prisoners and hidden for future use. The official Japanese report described the failed raid as evidence of significant guerrilla infiltration of the camp perimeter, and recommended immediate transfer of Camp O'Donnell's most valuable prisoners to more secure facilities. But the transfer was delayed by logistical problems and higher priority operations, giving Chen time to complete his most important mission of all. For 2 weeks, he trained 3 other prisoners in advanced marksmanship techniques, passing on everything his grandfather had taught him about patience, breathing, and understanding your target's habits. The mail-order rifle would continue its work even if Chen were discovered or killed, ensuring that Camp O'Donnell's invisible guardian could protect the escape network that was slowly bleeding prisoners into the guerrilla forces. But the larger war was changing faster than anyone in Camp O'Donnell understood. American forces were advancing across the Pacific, island by island, campaign by campaign. Japanese resources were being diverted to more critical fronts. The Philippines, once a crown jewel of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, was becoming a backwater where supplies ran short and reinforcements never came. By late 1943, Japanese patrol activity around Camp O'Donnell never recovered from Chen's 8 nights of precision shooting. Guerrilla operations flourished in an environment where Japanese forces had been reduced to defensive positions and supply convoy protection. Prisoner mortality rates dropped significantly as reprisal executions became rare and food supplies improved through guerrilla interdiction of Japanese logistics. Chen survived the war, though he never spoke publicly about his role in the guerrilla campaign that helped keep Camp O'Donnell's prisoners alive. After liberation in 1945, he returned to California and worked as a ranch foreman until his death in 1987. His mail-order rifle was donated to a small museum in Stockton, where it sits today in a display case labeled Hunting Rifle, World War II Era, Donor Unknown. But the story didn't end with liberation. Dr. Martinez, who also survived the war, spent decades trying to document what had really happened during those crucial months in 1943. His research revealed that prisoner mortality at Camp O'Donnell had dropped by nearly 60% after February 1943, a statistical anomaly that Japanese records attributed to improved camp administration and reduced guerrilla activity. The truth was more complex. Chen's precision shooting campaign had indeed reduced guerrilla attacks on Japanese positions, but only because the guerrillas no longer needed to assault fortified positions to obtain weapons and supplies. They were receiving both through the escape network that Chen's actions had protected, along with experienced soldiers who brought tactical knowledge acquired during their captivity. Sergeant Hayes, who survived to retirement as a career NCO, occasionally told the story of the quiet Chinese-American private who had changed the war with a rifle that couldn't hit a barn. But Hayes never revealed Chen's name, and military historians who studied guerrilla operations in the Philippines occasionally reference the Candaba River sniper without ever connecting him to Camp O'Donnell. Military historians who have studied guerrilla operations in the Philippines occasionally reference the Candaba River sniper, a mysterious marksman whose 8 nighttime engagements between February and April 1943 eliminated 97 Japanese soldiers and fundamentally altered the tactical balance in the Camp O'Donnell sector. But none of the academic analyses have connected this phantom sniper to a quiet Chinese-American prisoner, whose only weapon was a rifle that career soldiers had dismissed as a mail-order piece of junk. Perhaps that's exactly how Chen would have wanted it. His grandfather had taught him that the best hunting was done quietly, without fanfare or recognition, by men who understood their business and did what needed to be done. In the end, what needed to be done was saving lives, and Tommy Chen's cheap rifle had proven more than adequate for that most important of missions. The last entry in Dr. Martinez's private journal, written 50 years after the war, captured something that no official history could record. We were taught to see only enemies until small acts revealed we were facing other human beings. That truth was harder to carry than hate, but it was also what made us human again when the war finally ended. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. In the end, how do you measure the weight of a single life against the mathematics of survival? Note, this story was compressed to stay within platform constraints while maintaining the essential narrative structure. The full 6,500 word version would expand each section proportionally, particularly the character development arcs and the detailed tactical sequences described in the premise.